Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session on learning how to plan your first Azure migration with me, Tom Button. A quick introduction from me. I'm a senior cloud pre-sales engineer and certified Azure virtual desktop specialist. I work for Inti, an indirect CSP and partner of Computer World. I hope you're enjoying the event so far, so thank you to Computer World for putting on such a fantastic event. And before we dive into the content today, obviously, if anything I speak about is of interest, anything we go through today, feel free to reach out to Computer World, who will be happy to discuss any of the content in further detail, perhaps set up separate sessions with you, and to discuss your migration project or any projects which are upcoming within the space. So without further ado, let's jump in. So from an agenda standpoint, what are we going to look at today? We'll do a quick introduction to the topic and consider why you're likely on this session. We're not going to go through, what Azure is and so on, but a quick overview as to why you're likely on the session, and we'll set the scene for the rest of the session. We'll then go through the key components to consider as part of a framework to any cloud transformation, specifically in this instance, moving to Azure, and specifically within that, readiness, landing zones, and so on. Slide 3 will focus on discovery and assessments and why you should make this a pivotal factor when planning any migration, but specifically your first. We'll then look at the migration itself, what tools are available to you, especially through your MSP, to be able to assist you in that journey and to make that transition as easy as possible, and ultimately how your MSP can help you on that journey as well. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some final considerations and some final thoughts to take away. So if we move into the next slide, if we move into the introduction, now, as I said, I'm not going to go over what Azure is, as I'm sure you know that, considering you're attending a session on how to deliver your first migration into Azure, but you're likely on this session for a reason, and that's probably because you're either embarking on or at least considering a migration to Azure, I'd hope. And if I was to hazard a guess, I'd say that you're perhaps experiencing one of the on-screen reasons as to why businesses look to move their services to the cloud. So maybe you're struggling with capacity, maybe your hardware is coming to the end of its lifespan. You need stronger compliance to protect your clients. You may even be experiencing 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 of those reasons, okay? But I think it's important to note that as we move through this session, is when I talk about an Azure migration doesn't have to be kind of an all at once, nor is there a single templated approach to fit all businesses of all sizes. You have to build and take the approach that is most suitable to you, your IT team, and your organization. Now, of course, there's going to be businesses that go through a POC or a proof of concept, which is essentially a testing of said solution for a month or so. Maybe they'll run that for 4 to 6 weeks potentially, and if they're happy with the solution at the end of it, then they'll move their entire infrastructure to Azure. But you'll also find businesses that will drip feed their infrastructure into Azure a bit by bit. So initially they might use Azure for backup and DR purposes potentially. They'll look at rehosting their identity solution into Azure. They might use Azure Virtual Desktop for remote app streaming. They might store data in Azure. So it really depends on the approach that you want to take. But what I would always say is that when you're following a migration process, from an Azure standpoint anyway, the steps that I typically consider are assessing, migrating, and optimizing. Okay, and this is ultimately where working with a competent Azure MSP like Computer World is completely invaluable. They'll work with you to achieve the goals that you set out from the very beginning, alongside that 3-step approach. And you'll probably hear me say throughout this session, and that's why working with a competent Azure MSP is beneficial, because as we move through these steps, you'll notice that having that vast experience of working with multiple customers is completely invaluable. Okay. So if we move on to the next slide, cloud adoption framework. So I've actually run an entire 1-hour webinar and workshops to our partners on this before, but we don't have that long. So I'm going to try and condense it as much as I possibly can. So just to give a quick overview as to what it is, it's a really, really, really well hidden free resource provided by Microsoft that's full of guides, documentations, comparison charts, flow charts, whatever you name it with regards to an Azure migration, it's likely going to be in there, okay? It's the framework that all Microsoft architects, the pre-sales teams, the deployment teams, all align themselves to, and it's what we align ourselves to here at Inti as well. So the engineering team, the support desk, and so on, that's what we work alongside, okay? In terms of the kind of stuff that you might find in there, let's say, for example, you come from an on-premise background. Within the framework, you'll find comparisons for those on-prem workloads, which you're traditionally familiar of working with, and what their suitor is in Azure. So let's say you've got file server on-premise, for example. The natural transition would be to spin up a VM in Azure and then host that as a file server, right? Whereas within the cloud adoption framework, you'll find, as I said, the suitor in Azure. So from my perspective, given obviously having experience in this kind of stuff, I would look at a comparison of a VM potentially for comparison reasons, but also Azure Files, potentially blob storage as well, depending on what the use case is. But the cloud adoption framework will give you that comparison as well. Okay, it's really, really undervalued, super easy to access. If you just simply type in cloud adoption framework for Azure into Google or into your browser, it will be top couple of hits. So would recommend looking at that for sure. And as you can see, it's broken down into various sections, and then further subsections as well. And then within there, there's actually more subsections too. So sections which you should be considering regardless when you're going down the route of an Azure migration. So strategy, plan, ready, migrate, innovate, govern, manage, and organize. But for the purpose of this session, I'll specifically focus on 3, as they coincide quite well with the assess, migrate, and optimize migration steps that I've already discussed. And they're going to be plan, ready, and migrate. So if we start with plan, so from the very, very beginning, organizational alignment. Okay, so who in your organization is going to be responsible for what component of your digital transformation? What will computer world control? What will you work collaboratively on? There's so many elements to Azure. So understanding what people in your business are best suited to controlling which different technical element. Obviously, you could have somebody looking after Azure as a whole, but you're likely going to have people that would specialize in different components. Who is best to manage the commercial element? Who's best to look at pricing of your pre-existing solution versus what that potential new solution looks like? Who understands the licensing and so on? And this moves me on to the next point, which is the skills readiness plan. So, and this is actually where the majority of end user organizations tend to struggle, is having the required technical skill set in-house to deploy the new environment, or even actually plan it, to be honest with you, especially in the SMB space. And, even if you're intending on hiring new people or upskilling internally, so you'll likely have an IT support desk or somewhat familiar setup, upskilling those individuals isn't going to be an immediate fix, nor is hiring somebody externally. They're going to require time regardless, which is why using that MSP, who are proficient from an Azure standpoint, is a huge, huge benefit. As I mentioned before, you can lean on their experience of migrating multiple customers, and they've already got the skills internally anyway. Whether that's going to be assisting your team in potentially upskilling or undertaking the project or working with you on the project, it's completely invaluable. And the last point I want to focus on in the plan stage is rationalizing your digital estate, and we'll come on to this in a bit more detail when we talk about assessments and discoveries. But to summarize, what assets do you currently have on premise? What dependencies exist with those assets? Are they sized correctly? Are they being potentially underutilized? Are they being potentially overutilized? Because, if we look at a typical on-prem infrastructure, 9 times out of 10 servers are overspec'd. It's only natural though, because organizations have to consider future business plans for the lifespan of that server. Are we expecting growth? Do we have peak times when our servers have additional load? if you take a startup business, for example, let's say the organization starts with 5 users, but they're expecting exponential growth in their headcount over the next 12, 24 months. They've just secured maybe external funding and so on. The servers which you buy at that point, your on-premise physical servers, will have to account for those expectations down the line. Whereas with Azure, we don't need to do that. And that's the beauty of Azure, right? We only pay for what we need now. So if we take that 5-user scenario, we provision our 2-core, 4-core, whatever that looks like, virtual machine. And then in a year's time, when the requirement is a necessity, we then look to upgrade at that time. Okay. No need to provision now for future considerations. Okay. And this sounds obviously all very obvious, but all of these points are completely vital. And whether you figure that out for yourself or you work alongside your MSP to conclude this, it's completely a necessity. Okay. And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail later as to why. So moving on, if we refer back to the 3 initial stage approach, which was assess, migrate, and optimize, we're kind of crossing over between assess and migrate now. So now you've rationalized your estate, you've aligned your organization with the correct skills and so on. You'll want to progress to the next stage in the framework, where you'll find Azure landing zones, the setup guides for landing zones specifically, operating model alignment, and best practices for Azure readiness. Okay, so Azure setup guides does exactly what it says on the tin. It has all the resources you could possibly desire, from planning for governance and security through to managing access controls, so users only have access to the resources they're permitted. And the big one for me is landing zones. And now, although this sits under Migrate, this is very much part of the planning stage for any migration at all, but especially when it's your first one. The official outline of a landing zone is an environment for hosting your workloads pre-provisioned through code. But if we remove the code element, a landing zone is still pivotal. And I mean, from a distributor perspective and working with many partners and their customers, we way too often see businesses just simply accessing an Azure subscription with no to very little consideration for any predefined architecture, security, access controls, and a lot more. And they'll just proceed to build out production workloads and release them, which is quite simply not the approach that you want to be taking. Before we deploy, or before we advise any partners and customers to deploy any workloads, there's a number of key components that need to be planned out and at very least considered beforehand. So, even starting from the very top, your hierarchy, how are your management groups going to be structured? How are your subscriptions going to be structured? Are you going to have one subscription for your business, or are you going to have multiple subscriptions potentially per cost center? So maybe per location or per department. How are you going to structure your resource groups? Are you going to stick with that one subscription per business, and then have resource groups which then segment down into department or cost center, and then obviously the resources themselves? How are you going to tag those resources? Are you going to have predefined naming conventions? Are you going to tag them so you can filter them in cost management easier? They're all things that need to be considered. Have you set up your identity solution correctly? Have you set up access controls? Are your users going to be able to self-password reset? Are you going to enable single sign-on? Do you have your virtual network set up correctly? If you were to go into the Azure portal now, having not used it before, and provision a virtual machine, for example, a virtual network is a prerequisite regardless. So if you don't have one, Azure is going to create a default one for you. But what you would want to do is predefine that yourself, so having your relevant subnet ranges created and so on. If you're planning on creating a business continuity solution, you want to have that created before you start releasing workloads. You're going to want to create a vault where your backup and your DR recovery points are restored from. Again, a prerequisite. Have you enabled the monitoring tools? So have you enabled Azure Monitor, Cost Management, Advisor? They don't cost anything, but enabling them is pivotal. Once you're through the ready stage, the very next logical step, which consists of Azure migration guides. Oh, let me do that again. Once you're through the ready stage, the next logical step is to obviously migrate, which in the cloud adoption framework consists of migration guides, migration scenarios, best practices for cloud migration, process improvements, and so on. And it's all in line with the framework. And again, I know I said I'd keep saying it, but this is where using an MSP is completely invaluable. Everything we've spoken about so far with regards to even the migrate steps, but from a planning perspective, landing zones, having your naming conventions set up correctly. How is your hierarchy going to be structured? How do you enable the native tools in Azure? This is all stuff that working with an MSP, like Computer World, will be something that you benefit from, because this is all the knowledge that they've gained with working through all of those customers' migrations, working with us, working with Microsoft so closely. They will work alongside that framework, which is, again, what we would recommend you will do. And that leads me quite nicely on to discovery and assessments. Okay, so now we've understood kind of the loose framework and understood how important rationalizing your current state is. How can you determine what you essentially need in Azure? And I spoke about earlier how the majority of businesses overspec on-prem workloads, but this is where assessment tool comes in. And there's going to be two that we talk about today. So you've got the Azure native tooling, so Azure Migrate, and you have enhanced tooling as well through third-party solutions, which Computer will have access to as being a partner of Inti. So if we take servers, for an example, Azure Migrate, which actually I'm just going to touch on Azure Migrate. I know the title is Azure Migrate, but it also encompasses the assess piece as well. There used to be two different solutions. There would be one for kind of the assessment piece and then one for the migration piece, but they have been combined into the two. So don't be confused by the title Azure Migrate as being just for migration. It also encompasses the assessment piece as well. So Azure Migrate will assess, on-prem VMs, physical servers, and then we'll provide reports for Azure readiness. It will provide you with reports on suitable size instances in Azure based on utilization. So when I say utilization, I mean not just current specifications and looking for a direct comparison in Azure. It will look at what your users are using, what your business is using, and then make that recommendation for you based on that utilization. It will also look at dependency analysis. It will provide you with cost estimations as well, which will all be included in the overarching report. Above and beyond servers, there's also the ability to assess databases, web apps, data and storage too. And actually something which isn't on this slide, which is virtual desktop infrastructure. And then in addition to the native Azure tooling, as I said, Computer will have access to third-party tools which provide enhanced features and functionalities. So enhanced features being enhanced reports for one, and then functionality being additional areas for assessment. So it will also cover the infrastructure piece, which covers everything that Azure Migrate covers, but with the enhanced reporting, so servers, storage, and databases, as we've already touched on. You then have the Azure Virtual Desktop tooling, which will analyze your whole VDI infrastructure, virtual desktop infrastructure on premise, and then we'll provide reports for AVD user profiling, storage recommendations for user profiles or for general storage in the estate, and bandwidth recommendations as well, so like per user bandwidth recommendations and what that looks like in Azure. And then it will provide you with, again, the whole solution spec, so what session hosts you should be using, what disk sizes you should be using, should you be using premium, standard SSDs, what your storage solution should look like for the user profiles. Are you going to be using storage bases direct? Are you going to be using Azure files and so on? And this will take that pain away from you. Okay. But interestingly, though, what the third-party tools offer is extended functionality. Okay, so we also have the option for assessing for cybersecurity, which will scan your entire environment for vulnerabilities and recommendations to improve your secure score in a number of different areas. And also modern workplace as well, which is quite an interesting one. So it will access, say, the W365 components of your environment and look at end user adoption of applications, license adoption, and so on. So let's say, everyone in your business has an M365 on a business premium license, for example. You can look at which users are utilizing, say, Teams applications, who's utilizing OneDrive, who's utilizing tasks, and so on and so on. And as I said, these are all available through your MSP. So Computer World will have access to assessment tools either natively in Azure or through their partnership with us. And I would highly recommend any project that you work on, especially if it's your first project, running an assessment. Okay, it takes away any of the concern around, what does the pricing look like in Azure? It takes away any concern around what do we actually need. Are these the right options? And I think this is where the majority of businesses do tend to get a bit confused. Is they understand what everything looks like from an on-prem perspective, but when you try and transition that into Azure, or you begin to have the Azure conversation, because there's so many options available to you, it's not always just a rip and replace. It's not just we've got a SQL server, let's just build a VM in Azure and just chuck SQL on it. You also have Azure SQL solutions available to you as well, so the platform as a service products. So looking at which solution is actually going to be best for what you need, and the costings around that as well. So completely invaluable, and a huge benefit to be able to use those through Computer World as your MSP. So now we've completed our assessment and we have an understanding of what we need in Azure. The next step is the migration. So whether that's releasing or deploying into our templated environment as part of the Azure Migrate tool, which actually I'm just going to expand on slightly. The Azure Migrate tool encompasses not only just the migration piece, but also the assessment piece. So when we talk about Azure Migrate for assessments in the previous slide, just be confident in knowing that it is the same solution. It's the same single pane of glass solution that you use for assessments and migration. So leading on from that, the second part of the Azure Migrate tool is the migration itself. And as you can see on screen here, there's a number of workloads that we can migrate using that tool. So on-premise servers, including SQL Server instances, which can be moved to Azure VMs, VMware VMs to Azure, alternative cloud VMs, and so on. Databases can be moved to Azure SQL Database or to SQL managed instances using the tool. Web applications as well, which can be moved to Azure App Services using the Azure App Service Migration Assistant, which is part of the Azure Migration single pane of glass solution. VDI as well to Azure Virtual Desktop, and large amounts of data using the Azure Data Box products. But with regards to the migration itself, you obviously have a number of strategies available to you. So you've got rehosting, just lifting and shifting. You've got refactoring or repackaging, as some people like to call it, re-architecting and rebuilding. Okay, so ultimately you can use the migration solution if you want to go down the route of lifting and shifting for so on purposes. So taking what you currently have on premise and then moving that into the cloud without potentially even an assessment if you wanted to. But what you could do is you could look to re-architect and rebuild. So taking into consideration the assessment piece, which we've already spoken about, and making those improvements part of your migration journey into the new cloud platform. Okay, you don't necessarily even have to use a migration tool if you don't want to. You could just start from scratch. If you've got a relatively small infrastructure on premise, maybe you just want to migrate your domain controller potentially, but everything else could potentially be rebuilt. And again, have a conversation with your MSP, have that conversation internally, see which method of migration works best for you. It's, as I said at the very, very beginning, it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. There isn't a one-step template to every single Azure migration. Everything is different. So work with your MSP, have those conversations, figure out what's going to be best for you, your IT team, and yourself, and take it from there. And if we look at the final considerations then. So now we've looked at migrating the services, we've looked at the assessments and discovery. The next phase includes reviewing the solution for areas of improvement. Okay, and what we could include, reviewing the design of the solution, potentially right-sizing, analysing costs, and so on. Okay, so the key considerations for me at the optimization stage, monitoring your costs and see how to optimize them with potentially a better mix of Azure services. We just spoke about platform as a service solutions there. Could that improve your cost, or could it improve your automation? Okay. Monitor performance and ensure that you're meeting your migration goals, providing at least the same performance you had on premise or hitting the new performance targets. And beyond the immediate goal of migration as well, plan your next steps. Okay, so what can you do in Azure next? Are you going to further modernize? Are you going to unlock new functionalities through automation? There's a number of things that you can look at. And I guess a final consideration from a distributor's perspective, and the experience that we see on a daily basis working with a wide variety of partners and their customers, is it's vital to select a competent MSP partner like Computerworld that will assist you on that cloud transformation journey. There's a number of steps beyond just moving to Azure and migrating your products, right? There's a whole planning stage that goes into it from a governance and security perspective, making sure that your business is secure as possible, making sure that your organization is in the best possible position to make that transition and to have a very, very successfully running environment, fully optimized, fully modern, fully secure, fully governed, and so on. And having that experience from Computerworld to be able to lean on, as I've mentioned, is completely invaluable. So if you want to, I would recommend having a conversation with them regarding the migration you're potentially embarking on, or even if you're exploring the possibility, just having that conversation. Anyway, that's it from me, and I hope you enjoyed today's session. Enjoy the rest of the event, and again, thank you to Computerworld for accommodating the session. Take care for now.